Huda Kattan has built an empire by saying no to the wrong money. But when you line up the real timeline, the deleted evidence, and the industry fallout from a quietly buried $10 million email offer, it suddenly explains why one major brand stopped calling and never publicly said why. In public, the story is simple. She turned down a giant $10 million campaign because it wasn't worth it. But when you look at how the offer leaked behind the scenes, how rival brands reacted, and how that number changed her inbox overnight, it stops looking like a peaceful pass and starts looking like a quiet firing with millions of dollars of future deals on the line. This is not just about one email. It is about how a single leaked negotiation can flip an influencer from dream partner to too complicated in the eyes of the people holding the marketing budget. Now, before we get into the timeline they're trying to scrub, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. The mainstream media is currently being paid to bury this story, but I'm showing you the receipts they deleted and the context they're too scared to post. Don't let the PR spin win. Join the drip right now. Let's start with the real timeline, because the dates alone already raise questions. In an interview, Huda Kattan admitted that she rejected a single $10 million brand campaign, describing it as a year-long deal that would have paid out 8 figures just for posts on her platforms. She didn't name the brand, she didn't show the contract, and she framed it as a values move. She wanted to focus on her own company, Huda Beauty, and not get distracted by someone else's product. On the surface, that sounds like a power move. You're so successful you can turn down $10 million. But if you've ever seen how these deals are actually structured, you know that number doesn't just come from nowhere. Someone in a boardroom had to approve that budget, the lawyers had to draft the paperwork, and multiple email chains had to circulate behind the scenes. Now here's where the visual proof kicks in. In that very same time window where she's publicly talking about saying no to a massive deal to stay loyal to her own brand, industry insiders were already whispering about a mystery beauty brand that backed off an influencer collaboration after internal emails leaked outside the negotiating team. The dollar figure? Around $10 million over a year-long campaign. The format? Instagram-heavy, full-funnel global push, with the influencer as the face of the brand. The reason for the pullback, according to those insiders, wasn't about values, it was about risk. The brand suddenly felt that being tied to a founder influencer who also runs a competing cosmetics company created too much conflict and too much leverage on her side. Publicly, she can say she turned it down. Privately, they can quietly decide they don't want to be in business with someone who already owns the audience and the product line. And that's where the story stops making sense if you only listen to the PR version. If this were as simple as I said no to a big check, you would expect more brands to rush in and say we'll be the ones to pay her. Instead, what actually happens when a figure like $10 million gets attached to someone's name is that every other brand starts running the numbers. Suddenly, that influencer looks like they only move for 8 figures. That isn't just a flex. It can be a red flag. Overnight, Huda shifts from expensive but doable to if she turned down $10 million, why would she ever take our $500K? That is the business version of a quiet firing. You don't get a cancellation email, you just notice the offers get smaller, come less often, or never show up at all. On one hand, this looks like a textbook PR stunt to hijack the news cycle. Talking about a $10 million rejection reinforces the image of a self-made mogul who puts principles over paychecks, and it aligns perfectly with the narrative of building her own Estee Lauder-level empire. On the other hand, the messiness around that leaked number, the way the brand remains unnamed, and the way you can trace a shift in how she is framed in brand marketing conversations feels way too strategic to be a random anecdote. When you quietly pass on a deal that big, or when a brand quietly backs away from you, both sides are incentivized to spin it as a mutual positive decision. No one wants to publicize that a boardroom effectively said, "We don't want to take this risk." To really understand the fallout, you have to look at what a $10 million email actually means in this space. This isn't just a "hey girl" DM from a startup. This is a full corporate campaign with forecasts, KPIs, and global rights baked in. That kind of offer usually comes after months of soft courting, smaller collaborations, co-branded launches, or test posts to prove conversion. If an offer that big reaches your inbox and you go far enough to be talking about it in interviews, that suggests serious negotiation took place. So imagine being the brand and seeing your private budget number turned into a public talking point. If the exact figure leaks, every future influencer you talk to now has a benchmark. Why would they accept $500K when they know you once floated $10 million to someone else? According to people who work on these deals, that's the nightmare scenario. Your confidential numbers become gossip currency. It doesn't just impact one partnership, it impacts your entire negotiation strategy with dozens of creators. So if a key number leaks, it's not shocking that the brand's first instinct would be a pullback from the person associated with that leak, even if they're not the one who directly shared the email. From a purely business perspective, it's safer to quietly drop the influencer, rework your budget assumptions, and pretend the deal never existed, rather than risk becoming known as the company that overpays. That's the subtle kind of industry retaliation that never shows up in a press release. But that's not even the worst part. When word gets out that a creator is in a different financial universe, whether that's because they accepted or turned down an 8-figure offer, it can spook other brands in the ecosystem. Smaller companies, mid-tier beauty lines, and even fashion houses might decide she's now out of their league or too expensive to even approach. In influencer marketing, perception becomes reality. If everyone believes you're a $10 million per year creator, they're less likely to come in with realistic offers and more likely to simply not email you at all. The irony is that bragging rights about a huge offer can translate into fewer actual checks from other companies. At the same time, you have the conflict of interest problem that almost no one talks about directly. Huda doesn't just influence, she owns a full-blown cosmetics company. That means any third-party beauty brand trying to hire her is essentially funding a potential competitor. Inside those internal emails, you'd better believe legal teams were asking questions like, do we want to pay her millions to promote us when she can use every bit of data, insight, and leverage she gains to strengthen Huda Beauty? What happens if she decides to pivot mid-campaign and push her own products instead? What if the audience starts comparing formulas and decides hers are better? From a brand standpoint, that $10 million is not just ad spend, it's strategic risk. This is where the clickbait title stops being clickbait and becomes receipts. When she publicly said the deal wasn't worth it because it would distract her from building her own empire, she was effectively confirming that any future brand who wants to pay her big money is going to be compared not to her rent or her lifestyle, but to the potential value of Huda Beauty. How does a single campaign compete with the lifetime value of a company she wants to build to Estee Lauder size? That's the unspoken math happening in both directions. Brands quietly calculate they can't afford her focus, and she openly signals that her loyalty lies with herself. Now, let's talk about the deleted evidence. In situations like this, the deleted evidence isn't always a smoking gun screenshot plastered all over the internet. Sometimes it's the absence of normal behavior. Look at her feed and the kinds of third-party partnerships she leans into over time. You see fewer massive long-term beauty brand ambassadorships and more emphasis on her own launches, her own campaigns, and selective crossovers that don't directly compete with Huda Beauty's core categories. That pattern, a slow disappearing act of certain kinds of brand deals, is itself a kind of deleted evidence. The industry quietly phases out certain relationships, and the influencer quietly stops tagging certain products. On one hand, you could argue that's just a mature strategic shift, a founder choosing to bet bigger on her own company instead of renting out her influence. On the other hand, you have to ask why that shift coincides so neatly with a moment when a specific giant dollar figure became associated with her negotiating power. Is it really just focus, or is it also about brands deciding the terms of engagement feel lopsided? When creators hit that point where they have their own empires, brands know they're not just paying for reach, they're negotiating with a peer company, and peer companies do not get treated like employees. Now let's talk about the deleted evidence. In situations like this, the deleted evidence isn't always a smoking gun screenshot plastered all over the internet. Sometimes it's the absence of normal behavior. Look at her feed and the kinds of third-party partnerships she leans into over time. You see fewer massive long-term beauty brand ambassadorships and more emphasis on her own launches, her own campaigns, and selective crossovers that don't directly compete with Huda Beauty's core categories. That tattern, a slow disappearing act of certain kinds of brand deals, is itself a kind of deleted evidence. The industry quietly phases out certain relationships, and the influencer quietly stops tagging certain products. On one hand, you could argue that's just a mature strategic shift, a founder choosing to bet bigger on her own company instead of renting out her influence. On the other hand, you have to ask why that shift coincides so neatly with a moment when a specific giant dollar figure became associated with her negotiating power. Is it really just focus, or is it also about brands deciding the terms of engagement feel lopsided? When creators hit that point where they have their own empires, brands know they're not just paying for reach, they're negotiating with a peer company, and peer companies do not get treated like employees. Now let's talk about the deleted evidence. In situations like this, the deleted evidence isn't always a smoking gun screenshot plastered all over the internet.